Dr. Regina Watson adjusted her rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of her meticulously pressed silk blouse and the pearl necklace her grandmother had given her upon earning her doctorate. The morning sun painted golden streaks across her silver Mercedes hood as she navigated through the tree-lined streets of Hampton Heights. Her smartphone, propped on the dashboard, displayed the time, 8:42 a.m. The board meeting would begin in 18 minutes. "Stay calm, Regina," she whispered to herself, rehearsing key points from her speech. As the newly appointed dean of Hamilton University Law School, her vision for modernizing legal education needed to be perfect. The presentation she'd spent weeks perfecting sat in a leather portfolio on the passenger seat, filled with innovative ideas for curriculum reform and community outreach programs. The familiar route to campus was gridlocked due to an overnight water main break. Her GPS suggested a detour through Oakwood, a charming neighborhood she'd never explored despite living in the city for 3 years. Victorian houses with wraparound porches lined the streets, their gardens bursting with early autumn chrysanthemums. Regina noticed how the other drivers, mostly in luxury vehicles like hers, navigated the roads with the confidence of locals. She followed a sleek black BMW through the winding streets, taking in the neighborhood's quiet elegance. The detour seemed promising until her GPS announced, recalculating, in its robotic voice. "Not now," Regina muttered, glancing at the time again. 8:47 a.m. She'd have to park, check in with security, and make it to the 4th-floor boardroom in 13 minutes. Her heart quickened as she realized she might be late for her first major presentation as dean. The street ahead forked, with no clear signage. Regina eased her foot off the gas, carefully scanning both options. The left path seemed to lead toward campus, judging by the distant spire of Hamilton's historic clock tower. She signaled and turned, maintaining a steady pace through the unfamiliar territory. A crossing guard waved cheerfully as she passed the local elementary school, where children in colorful backpacks streamed through the front gates. Regina smiled, remembering her own school days and the teachers who'd inspired her journey into education. The memory calmed her slightly, even as precious minutes ticked by. Her phone chimed with a text message. At the next stop, she glanced down to see a message from her assistant. "Board members arriving early. Coffee and pastries served." Regina's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Being late wasn't an option, not today of all days. The GPS finally reoriented itself, showing Hamilton University just half a mile ahead. Regina could see the campus gates in the distance, their wrought iron elegance a welcome sight. The morning sun caught the university's motto etched in stone: "Through knowledge, justice prevails." Those words had inspired her throughout law school, and now they seemed particularly poignant as she prepared to shape the next generation of legal minds. As she approached the final intersection before campus, Regina noticed a police cruiser parked discreetly beneath a maple tree. She double-checked her speed, though she knew she'd been careful throughout the drive. The officer seemed occupied with paperwork, and Regina proceeded forward, already mentally rehearsing her opening remarks to the board. The clock read 8:52 a.m. If she could find parking quickly, she might still make it on time. Regina reached over to straighten her portfolio, ensuring her presentation materials were in perfect order. In that brief moment, flashing lights appeared in her rearview mirror, and the distinct sound of a police siren pierced the quiet morning air. 2 weeks later, the municipal courthouse stood imposing against the steel-gray morning sky. Dr. Regina Watson climbed the worn marble steps, her heels clicking softly against stone that had witnessed decades of justice and injustice alike. The traffic citation felt stiff in her leather briefcase, alongside the dashcam footage she'd retrieved from her vehicle's security system. Inside, the courthouse hallway hummed with whispered conversations and shuffling papers. Regina checked the docket posted outside courtroom 3B, confirming her place in the morning's proceedings. She'd chosen to contest the ticket not for the fine's amount, but for the principle. She knew with absolute certainty that she had followed every traffic law that morning. The wooden bench creaked as she sat down, smoothing her charcoal pencil skirt. Around her, Other citizens waited their turn. A young man in paint-splattered work clothes, an elderly woman clutching a worn purse, a businessman rapidly typing on his phone. Regina pulled out her tablet, reviewing the email she'd had to send to the board rescheduling their crucial meeting that fateful morning. "All rise," the bailiff's voice commanded, cutting through the murmured conversations. Judge Michael Brennan entered, his black robe swaying with each deliberate step. Regina studied him as he took his seat behind the elevated bench. His silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses projected an air of wisdom, while the set of his jaw suggested unwavering determination. The judge's chambers behind him displayed an impressive collection of credentials. Regina's attention caught on a familiar diploma. Hamilton University Law School, dated 20 years earlier. Her own office now overlooked the same courtyard where the diploma had been presented. A slight smile crossed her lips at the connection, but it faded as she watched the proceedings unfold. Case after case moved swiftly through the system. The young man in work clothes received a reduced fine after explaining he'd been rushing to his sick daughter. The elderly woman's case was dismissed with a warning. The businessman accepted his penalty without contest, already reaching for his wallet. "Regina Watson," the clerk called, her voice echoing through the now familiar chamber. Regina approached the podium with measured steps, standing tall as she'd done countless times before university boards and legal panels. She placed her evidence on the wooden surface, organized and ready. The morning light streaming through tall windows cast Judge Brennan's face in sharp relief as he glanced down at her citation. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used in lecture halls, "I wish to contest this citation with evidence that demonstrates full compliance with traffic laws on the morning in question." Judge Brennan peered over his glasses, his expression unchanged. "Proceed, Ms. Watson." "Dr. Watson," she corrected gently, reaching for her dashcam footage. "As my evidence will show, I came to a complete stop at the intersection of Maple and 3rd. I have timestamps and clear video documentation." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly at the correction of her title. He leaned back in his chair, fingers interlaced across his chest. Behind him, sunlight caught the golden frame of his Hamilton University diploma, creating an almost ironic halo effect. "You're asking this court to review video evidence for a simple traffic violation." His tone carried a hint of impatience. "Do you realize how many cases we process each day, Dr. Watson?" The emphasis he placed on her title didn't escape her notice. Regina stood firm, her hand steady as she held out the data drive containing her evidence. The morning light continued to stream through the windows, dust motes dancing in the silence that followed her response. "Yes, Your Honor. I also realize the importance of justice being served accurately, regardless of the case's size." The courtroom air grew heavy as Judge Brennan examined Dr. Watson's dashcam footage. His fingers drummed a slow rhythm on his desk, the sound echoing in the hushed chamber. The morning light had shifted, casting long shadows across the floor as time crept forward. "Dr. Watson," Judge Brennan began, removing his glasses and placing them deliberately on his bench. "While I appreciate the thoroughness of your preparation, the video quality isn't clear enough to definitively prove your claim." He paused, folding his hands. "The officer's report states clearly that you rolled through the stop sign." Regina stood perfectly still, her expression composed despite the flutter of frustration in her chest. Years of courtroom experience as a legal scholar had taught her to maintain poise under pressure. "Your Honor, if you'll note the timestamp at 8:52 a.m., the vehicle's forward motion completely ceases for 3 seconds. Judge Brennan raised an eyebrow, his patience visibly wearing thin. Other cases waited, and the morning's agenda was already running behind. "Dr. Watson, this court has heard numerous creative interpretations of traffic laws. Your academic credentials, while impressive, don't change the facts before us." Regina's hand tightened slightly on the podium. Through the windows, she could see Hamilton University's clock tower in the distance, the same view she now enjoyed from her dean's office. "With respect, Your Honor," This isn't about interpretation. The evidence shows. The evidence, Judge Brennan interrupted, his voice carrying a hint of finality, is insufficient to override the sworn testimony of an experienced officer. He picked up his gavel, already beginning to turn his attention to the next case. The court finds you in violation. The fine will be $200, due within 30 days. Regina took a deep breath, her mind racing through years of legal precedent and procedure. Your Honor, I request permission to submit additional evidence. My vehicle's onboard computer system records. The gavel struck, the sharp crack silencing her words. Dr. Watson, this court's time is valuable. The fine stands. Judge Brennan's tone softened slightly, almost patronizing. Consider this a learning experience. Those words, ones she'd used countless times with her own students, struck something deep within Regina. She straightened her spine, gathering her materials with deliberate care. The courtroom watched in silence as she placed her evidence back in her briefcase, each movement precise and controlled. Thank you for your time, Your Honor, she said, her voice clear and steady. The words carried no trace of the frustration building inside her. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of the Hamilton University diploma again, its gold lettering catching the light. The bailiff called the next case as Regina made her way back through the gallery. She passed the remaining defendants, sensing their eyes on her as she walked toward the exit. Her heels clicked against the floor, each step marking time like a metronome. At the heavy wooden doors, Regina paused. Through the windows, she could see her beloved university standing proud against the morning sky. In her mind, she was already composing an email to her colleagues in the Criminal Justice Department. This experience, though frustrating, would not be wasted. As she pushed open the door, Judge Brennan's voice faded behind her, continuing the day's proceedings as if their interaction had been routine. But Regina knew, with the certainty that had driven her entire career, that nothing about this morning had been routine. She stepped into the hallway, her mind already formulating plans for change. Plans that would reach far beyond a simple traffic citation. Judge Michael Brennan settled into his leather office chair, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across his chambers. His coffee, third cup of the day, sat cooling on a worn leather coaster, a gift from his first year as a judge. The day's cases had left him mentally drained, though he'd never admit it to his colleagues. Opening his laptop, he began his daily ritual of clearing emails. Delete. Archive. Reply. The rhythm was almost meditative after 15 years on the bench. His cursor hovered over a message from Hamilton University's Alumni Association, and he clicked it out of habit more than interest. Dear distinguished alumni, the email began. Judge Brennan's eyes skimmed past the usual fundraising appeals and event announcements. A flash of color caught his attention, a photograph beneath the heading Leadership Spotlight. His hand froze on the mouse. The woman in the image stood proudly before Hamilton's historic law library, her smile confident and warm. The same smile he'd seen just hours ago, though it had been considerably more restrained in his courtroom. The caption below read, Dr. Regina Watson, newly appointed Dean of Hamilton University Law School, brings 2 decades of experience in criminal justice reform and legal education. Coffee forgotten. Judge Brennan leaned forward, his reading glasses sliding down his nose. The article detailed Dr. Watson's impressive career. Harvard Law Review, distinguished professor at Yale, landmark research in judicial bias, and now, dean of his beloved alma mater. His throat tightened as he remembered his dismissive tone earlier that day. Consider this a learning experience, he had told her. The words now echoed in his mind with uncomfortable irony. He clicked through to her full biography on the university website, each accomplishment landing like a weight on his conscience. Outside his chamber windows, the courthouse square bustled with afternoon activity. A group of law students, probably from Hamilton, crossed the plaza with their arms full of books. Judge Brennan watched them, remembering his own days as a student, full of ideals about justice and equality. He minimized the email and pulled up the morning's court records. Dr. Watson's case file looked different now. He reviewed the dashcam footage again, this time with greater attention. The 3-second stop she had mentioned was there, subtle but clear. His judgment had been swift, routine, perhaps too routine. Rising from his desk, Judge Brennan walked to the window. The Hamilton University clock tower was visible in the distance, its spire reaching into the autumn sky. For 20 years, he'd looked at that tower from this window, proud of his connection to the institution. Now that pride mixed with something else, an uncomfortable awareness of his own assumptions. His phone buzzed with a reminder about next week's alumni dinner. Dr. Watson would be there. Of course, the guest of honor, introducing her vision for the law school's future. He would have to face her again, this time knowing who she was, what she had achieved. Judge Brennan returned to his desk, the leather chair creaking as he sat. His coffee had gone completely cold, much like the certainty he'd felt during this morning's proceedings. He opened a blank document on his computer and began to type, then stopped. What could he say? How does one address such a moment? The cursor blinked steadily on the empty page, like a metronome marking time between who he had been this morning and who he needed to be now. The autumn sun continued its slow descent, painting his chambers in shades of gold and shadow, as Judge Michael Brennan faced one of the hardest deliberations of his career, the judgment of himself. The evening air carried a hint of autumn as Judge Brennan walked through Pioneer Park, his suit jacket draped over his arm. He'd left his chambers earlier than usual, seeking solitude to clear his mind. The park's winding paths, normally a source of peace after long days on the bench, felt different tonight. Children played on the nearby playground, their laughter carrying across the carefully maintained lawns. A young girl in a pristine private school uniform sprinted past him, her father calling after her to be careful. The scene triggered a memory from that morning's court session. How quickly he'd made assumptions, how easily he'd dismissed evidence. Reaching a familiar bench overlooking the duck pond, Michael sat down. The setting sun painted the water in shades of amber and rose. He pulled out his phone, opening the Hamilton University website again. Dr. Watson's profile page showed her accepting a prestigious legal award, her achievement sparkling in her eyes. The same eyes that had looked directly at him in court, maintaining dignity despite his dismissal. A jogger passed by, nodding in recognition, probably one of the many lawyers who appeared in his courtroom. Michael barely registered the greeting, his mind replaying years of similar cases. How many times had he rushed through decisions, relying on what he'd considered experience, but might have been something else entirely? He opened his briefcase, withdrawing a worn leather journal he'd kept since his first day on the bench. 15 years of notes on challenging cases, ethical dilemmas, moments that had shaped his judicial philosophy. The pages rustled as he turned to a fresh sheet, beginning to write. Today, I learned something about justice that wasn't taught in law school. The words flowed more easily than he expected, filling page after page with honest self-examination. The park lights flickered on around him as dusk settled, but he continued writing. A security guard walked past, offering a respectful "Good evening, Your Honor." Michael looked up, realizing how long he'd been sitting there. Standing, he gathered his things and began walking toward the park's east exit, toward home. The route took him past Hamilton University's law school building, its windows glowing with evening classes in session. Through the glass, he could see students engaged in what appeared to be a moot court session. Their passionate gestures reminded him of his own student days, when justice seemed so clear, so black and white. His phone buzzed, an email from the Alumni Association confirming his attendance at next week's dinner. Dr. Watson would be introducing new initiatives for the law school, including a comprehensive review of the local justice system. The irony wasn't lost on him. Reaching his car, Michael placed his briefcase in the passenger seat, but kept his journal in hand. At home, he knew, he would continue writing. There were patterns to examine, assumptions to question, changes to consider. The weight of his judicial robe, which had always felt like a symbol of authority, now felt like a reminder of responsibility. The city lights began twinkling in the growing darkness as he drove home. Each intersection brought a full, complete stop, the kind Dr. Watson had testified about making. Small changes, he reflected, often preceded larger ones. Tomorrow, he would return to his courtroom, but something would be different. The justice he served would be tempered by this evening's reflections, by the understanding that true wisdom often comes from unexpected teachers. Dr. Regina Watson's office on the 4th floor of Hamilton Hall commanded a sweeping view of the university campus. Morning sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the law books lining her walls. Her laptop screen displayed dozens of open tabs, research papers, court records, and statistical analyses. "Sarah, could you come in, please?" she called to her assistant. The young woman appeared promptly, notepad ready. "I need you to schedule meetings with the heads of criminal justice, sociology, and data science departments. And please reach out to the State Bar Association about their traffic court data." Regina turned back to her computer, scrolling through the preliminary research she'd gathered. Her recent courtroom experience had sparked something larger than personal vindication. The carefully organized spreadsheet on her screen told a story through numbers, one that needed to be shared. A knock at her door interrupted her concentration. Professor James Chen, her mentor from her teaching days, and now a colleague, stood in the doorway. "I got your email about the new research initiative." "Ambitious scope, Regina. You're sure about this?" She gestured for him to take a seat in one of the leather chairs facing her desk. "James, what happened in that courtroom wasn't an isolated incident. Look at these preliminary findings." She turned her laptop toward him, showing graphs and charts she'd compiled over the past week. "Traffic court data from the past 5 years," she explained, pointing to key statistics. "The patterns are impossible to ignore, but we need more than just numbers. We need to understand the human impact." Professor Chen leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he studied the data. "This could ruffle some feathers in the judicial community," he observed, though his tone carried approval. "But then again, that's never stopped you before." Regina smiled, remembering their many discussions about challenging the status quo. "I'm not interested in pointing fingers, James. I want to create solutions." She pulled up another document, a draft proposal for a comprehensive study of the local justice system, with a focus on decision-making patterns in routine cases. Her phone buzzed with a message from the university president, confirming her speaking slot at next week's alumni dinner. Regina added it to her calendar, noting that several local judges would be in attendance. Perfect timing. "We'll need a strong research team," she continued, pulling out a folder containing student applications. "These third-year law students have already expressed interest. I want to pair them with graduate students from other departments. Get some fresh perspectives." The campus bells chimed the hour, their sound floating through her partially open window. Below, students crossed the quadrangle, their movements creating patterns like the data points on her screen. Each person's story mattered. Each interaction held significance. "The beauty of this position," Regina said, standing to gaze out at the campus, "is that we can do more than teach about justice. We can actively work to improve it." She turned back to her desk, picking up a pen to make notes on her proposal. "This study isn't about one judge or one courtroom. It's about understanding the small moments that shape people's trust in the legal system." Professor Chen nodded, recognizing the familiar determination in her voice. "Well, you've got my support. Where do we start?" Regina smiled, pulling up a detailed project timeline on her screen. "We start by gathering stories, collecting data, and building bridges. Change doesn't happen in isolation, James. It happens through understanding, one conversation at a time." The Grand Alumni Hall of Hamilton University sparkled with elegant chandeliers and animated conversation. Dr. Regina Watson paused at the entrance, taking in the scene before her. Distinguished alumni mingled with faculty members, their formal attire matching the room's grandeur. Her speech notes felt reassuring in her clutch bag, not that she needed them after a week of preparation. "Dr. Watson," The university president approached, champagne flutes in hand. "Everyone's excited about your presentation on the future of legal education." He offered her a glass, which she accepted with a gracious smile. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a familiar figure by the appetizer table, Judge Michael Brennan, looking somewhat less imposing in a charcoal suit rather than his judicial robes. "If you'll excuse me," she said to the president, her decision made in an instant. This moment had been inevitable, but she hadn't expected it so soon. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floor as she approached the appetizer table, each step measured and purposeful. Judge Brennan looked up as she reached for a stuffed mushroom. Their eyes met, and the bustling room seemed to quiet around them. He set down his plate, his expression a complex mixture of recognition and discomfort. "Good evening, Your Honor," Regina said, her voice carrying the same professional tone she used in his courtroom. "The crab puffs are excellent." She selected one deliberately, breaking the tension with this simple observation. "Dr. Watson," he responded, clearing his throat. "I've been hoping for an opportunity to speak with you." His fingers fidgeted with his napkin, a far cry from his commanding courtroom presence. Regina gestured toward a quiet corner near a display of alumni achievements. "Shall we?" They moved away from the crowd, finding a moment of privacy beneath a framed photograph of the university's first graduating law class. "I've been reviewing our interaction in court," Judge Brennan began, his voice low and sincere. "And I've been examining many of my past decisions as well." Regina took a sip of champagne, giving him space to continue. The evening light filtering through the stained glass windows cast patterns across their faces, a reminder of the institution's long history of fostering meaningful dialogue. "Your research on judicial decision-making patterns," he continued, "I've been reading it. Your perspectives on routine judgments and their cumulative impact, they're compelling." He paused, meeting her eyes directly, "and personally convicting." "The patterns only become visible when we're willing to look for them," Regina responded, her tone free of accusation. "That's actually the focus of my new initiative here at Hamilton." She watched his expression carefully. "We're launching a comprehensive study of local court systems, focusing on everyday decisions that shape people's lives." A small smile crossed Judge Brennan's face. "And I suppose you could use an insider's perspective. Every voice adds value to the conversation." She replied diplomatically, though her own smile suggested she'd hoped for exactly this opening. The university president approached the podium, tapping the microphone. "If everyone could find their seats, we're about to begin our evening's program." Regina turned to the judge. "I have a faculty table near the front, but perhaps we could continue this discussion later. My office hours are every Wednesday afternoon." Judge Brennan nodded, understanding the significance of the invitation. "I believe I have some free time next Wednesday." He gestured toward the tables. "Break a leg with your speech, Dean Watson. I look forward to learning from you." 6 months later, sunshine flooded the Hamilton University Law School auditorium as Judge Michael Brennan stood at the podium. The seats were filled with judges, lawyers, and law enforcement officers, all gathered for the inaugural session of the Justice in Practice training program. "When I began my career on the bench," he began, his voice carrying to the back row, "I thought experience was enough. That efficiency meant justice." He paused, looking out at the attentive faces. "I was wrong." In the front row, Dr. Regina Watson sat with her research team, their months of data collection and analysis bound in reports before them. The study had revealed patterns that could no longer be ignored, but more importantly, it had offered solutions. Thanks to Dean Watson's groundbreaking research initiative, Judge Brennan continued, gesturing toward Regina, "We now understand how our split-second decisions shape the public's trust in our legal system." He clicked to the next slide, displaying a chart of their findings. Every traffic stop, every routine hearing, every seemingly minor judgment, they all matter. Regina noticed several of her colleagues nodding in agreement. The past months had transformed their initial courthouse encounter into something remarkable. Weekly meetings had become collaborative sessions, where practical experience met academic insight. Judge Brennan had brought other judges into the conversation, while Regina's students contributed fresh perspectives. Today's training program, the judge explained, represents a new approach to judicial education. We'll examine real cases, confront our own assumptions, and develop better practices together. His confident tone carried no trace of the defensiveness that had once characterized his courtroom demeanor. The morning light caught the Hamilton University crest on the wall. Through knowledge, justice prevails. Words that now carried deeper meaning for everyone involved in the project. Regina's gaze moved to her students in the back row, already taking notes. They would inherit this evolving system, carrying these lessons into their own legal careers. After the presentation, as participants broke into discussion groups, Regina approached Judge Brennan. "Excellent introduction, Your Honor. You've set the perfect tone for the program." He smiled, removing his reading glasses. "I had an excellent teacher, Dean Watson." They watched as the groups engaged in animated discussion, legal professionals from every level of the system sharing experiences and insights. "Next week's traffic court sessions will be interesting," Regina observed. "The data from our pilot program shows promising changes already." "Changes that go far beyond traffic violations," Judge Brennan agreed. "Yesterday, I had a young lawyer quote your research in a case presentation. Your influence is reaching the next generation already." Regina's phone buzzed, a message confirming that 3 more judicial districts had requested information about implementing the training program. What had begun as a single contested traffic ticket had grown into a movement for meaningful change. "We're just beginning," she said, watching a passionate debate unfold between a veteran judge and a rookie police officer. "Every person who leaves this room will affect countless lives in our community." Judge Brennan nodded, understanding the truth in her words. "You know, Dr. Watson, sometimes the most important lessons come from unexpected moments." He gestured to the engaged participants around them. "Like a routine traffic court session that turns out to be anything but routine." Regina smiled, remembering that morning in his courtroom that felt so long ago now. "The best kind of justice," she replied, "is the kind that grows and learns." Together, they watched their shared vision unfold, knowing that this was just the first chapter of a much larger story.